Okay, so I want you to picture this. A truly dramatic moment in the wild. A cheetah locks onto an impala,
Right.
and in less than a second, the impala's entire body, its physiology, completely rearranges itself. The heart rate triples, breath goes ragged, and all this stored sugar just floods the muscles.
It's an incredible instantaneous response.
So how does the sheer presence of a predator trigger something so massive, the total reorganization of an entire body?
Well, the answer is really all about the instant messaging system of life, and that is the focus of our deep dive today. Cell communication.
And it's not just some basic function, is it?
Oh, not at all. This is a universal, ancient, and, a highly sophisticated molecular language. It coordinates everything from a single-celled organism hunting for food all the way up to our own embryonic development.
The coordination is just unbelievable. And we owe a huge debt to scientists like Earl W. Sutherland, who first figured out how to break this language down into a manageable sequence.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, understanding that sequence is really the key to understanding the entire system.
So what is that sequence?
It's three non-negotiable stages. Stage one is reception. That's when the target cell detects the signal from the outside.
Like, say, the hormone epinephrine binding to a receptor.
Exactly. It binds perfectly. Then stage two is transduction.
Okay, transduction. So that the signal's information gets converted and, relayed inside the cell.
Yes, and it's almost never a single step. It's usually a chain reaction, a cascade of molecules passing that message from the membrane deep into the cell.
A cascade, right. And the final step.
Stage three, the cellular response. This is the final outcome, the action.
So in our impala example, that's the enzyme activation that breaks down glycogen into millions of glucose molecules for that immediate life-saving fuel.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the ground up, because the thing that really surprised me is just how old this system is. It's not some new invention. It's ancient.
Absolutely. Cell signaling is one of the most ancient biological processes. It evolved in, ancient prokaryotes and single-celled eukaryotes hundreds of millions of years ago.
Wow.
And what's really astonishing is that the molecular details you find in, say, a yeast cell trying to find a mate are strikingly similar to the ones in our own muscle cells.
So that similarity points to a really early origin.
A very early evolutionary origin that's been conserved across all domains of life.
And we can see that in how bacteria communicate.
Yeah.
Right. Through something called quorum sensing.
We can. Quorum sensing is essentially bacteria monitoring their local population density. They do it by sensing how many signaling molecules they're all collectively secreting into the environment.
So they're counting themselves, in a way.
They are. It lets them coordinate group behaviors that, that only really work when they have enough numbers to pull it off. A critical mass.
Like what?
Well, myxobacteria in the soil will only aggregate and form these spore-producing fruiting bodies when food gets scarce, and they sense the density is high enough to make that collective effort worthwhile. They wait for the quorum.
And this has a medical angle, too, which is where it gets really interesting. I'm thinking of Staphylococcus aureus, or S. aureus.
Yes. S. aureus uses quorum sensing to hold back, to delay secreting its powerful toxins until its population is big enough to launch a really effective infection that the immune system can't just easily fight off.
So that creates an opportunity for new therapies.
It does. Researchers ran an experiment to see if they could disrupt that toxin production by blocking the quorum sensing pathway. They tested two different inhibitory peptides, peptide 1 and peptide 2.
And the data was pretty clear, wasn't it?
Very. Compared to the control group with high toxin levels, peptide 1 alone reduced it. Peptide 2 alone also reduced it.
But when they added both together...
When they added peptide 1 and peptide 2 together, the toxin concentration just plummeted to almost zero.
So that strong effect suggests that S. aureus isn't just using one pathway.
Exactly. It must be using at least two different quorum-sensing pathways to make toxins, and those peptides were hitting both of them at the same time. It's a really promising way to fight infection without using traditional antibiotics.
Okay, so that's the microbial world. When we move up to multicellular organisms, the communication gets more specialized.
It does, but we still see two main local methods. First, there's direct contact.
Where cells are physically touching.
Right, molecules passing through gap junctions in animals, or plasmodesmata in plants, or even just cell surface molecules touching, which is crucial for immune cells.
And then there's local signaling with secreted molecules.
Yes, like paracrine signaling. That's when a cell releases local regulators like growth factors that affect nearby cells. It's like a neighborhood announcement system.
And in the nervous system, that becomes super specialized, right? Synaptic signaling.
Ultra specialized. An electrical signal triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which zip across that tiny gap, the synapse, to stimulate the target cell.
And for the really long distance stuff across the whole body.
For that, we rely on hormones. That's endocrine signaling. Specialized cells secrete molecules like insulin or epinephrine, and they travel through the bloodstream to reach distant targets.
And plants do this too.
They do. Sometimes their hormones travel in vessels, or in the case of a gas like ethylene, it just diffuses through the air to help ripen fruit.
Okay, so whether it's local or long distance, the cell has to be able to hear the signal. And that brings us to reception and specificity. So is it fair to say that without the right molecular key, the cell just completely ignores the signal?
That is exactly right. The signaling molecule is the ligand, the key, and it binds specifically to a receptor protein. That binding causes the receptor to change shape, and that shape change is what kicks off the signal.
And most of these receptors are in the plasma membrane, mainly because most ligands are water-soluble and can't get through the oily membrane interior.
That's right. And we have three main classes there, starting with the biggest one.
Which would be the G protein-coupled receptors, or GPCRs.
Yes. They're a massive family involved in vision, smell, taste, and ductility. Get this. GPCRs are the targets for about 60% of all medicines used today.
Wow, 60%. That's huge. So how do they work?
It's like a quick, elegant relay race. The ligand binds, changing the receptor's shape. That lets the receptor bind to an inactive G protein, which has GDP attached.
Okay.
The receptor then causes GTP to swap out that GDP, which activates the G protein.
And then that active G protein goes off and does its job.
It moves along the membrane and activates an enzyme, triggering the cascade. But here's the critical part for reversibility. The G protein is also a GTPase.
Meaning it can cut the phosphate off the GTP.
Exactly. It hydrolyzes that GTP back to GDP extremely fast, shutting itself off within seconds. This rapid shutdown is vital for our senses, making sure the signal is temporary.
Okay, so our second major type, receptor tyrosine kinases, RTKs, they work completely differently. They aren't just relays, they're enzymes themselves.
Yes, they're a type of protein kinase that specifically adds phosphate groups to the amino acid tyrosine.
And their activation involves this physical change, right? Dimerization.
It does. When two ligands bind, two separate receptor monomers come together to form a dimer. This act of coming together is what activates the kinase regions on the inside of the cell.
And this is where they're kind of master organizers. They phosphorylate the tyrosines on the other monomer.
Yeah.
And critically, those phosphorylated tyrosines become docking sites for a whole bunch of different relay proteins.
And that's the key difference. Unlike a GPCR, which usually just triggers one pathway, a single activated RTK can trigger 10 or more different transduction pathways all at once.
So you get much more bang for your buck.
A lot more. And this ability to coordinate a whole network is why they're so important for cell growth. It also explains why abnormal RTKs, like the HER2 receptor in some cancers, are so dangerous. They basically keep the grow signal permanently on.
And the third membrane type is the ligand-gated ion channel. These are all about speed.
Pure speed. The ligand binds, the protein gate opens, and specific ions like sodium or calcium just flood in down their concentration gradient, instantly changing the cell's electrical potential.
But we also have to talk about signals that just skip the membrane entirely.
Right. If the molecule is small or hydrophobic, like a steroid hormone or even the gas nitric oxide, it can just diffuse right through the plasma membrane.
And find its receptor where? Inside the cell.
Exactly. An intracellular receptor in the cytosol or even the nucleus. Take aldosterone in kidney cells. It goes in, binds its receptor, and the whole complex moves into the nucleus.
And once it's there.
It acts as a transcription factor. It binds to DNA and turns specific genes on. It's a slower process. You have to make new protein, but the change is usually much more long-lasting.
So once reception happens, we move to transduction, which you said is this massive amplification stage.
It is.
But wait, why do we even need a cascade? Why can't the receptor just do the final job?
It's a great question. It's because a single ligand binding one receptor is just too quiet of a signal. The whole point of a multi-step pathway is twofold. Massive amplification, turning one tiny signal into a huge response, and providing multiple points for coordination and control.
Okay, and the main way this happens is through phosphorylation and dephosphorylation.
The primary way. You have a phosphorylation cascade where one activated protein kinase uses ATP to stick a phosphate onto the next kinase in line, activating it, and so on.
It's a molecular switch.
A molecular switch that needs balance. To turn it off, you need protein phosphatases. These enzymes rapidly remove those phosphates' dephosphorylation in activating the kinases and resetting the switch. The cell's entire life depends on this constant battle between active kinases and active phosphatases.
And to help broadcast that signal really quickly, the cell often uses second messengers.
Yes, small, non-protein, water-soluble molecules or ions that can just diffuse rapidly through the cell. The classic example is cyclic AMP or CMP.
Okay, CMP.
So a GPCR pathway will often activate an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase, which turns out huge amounts of CAMP from ATP. That CAMP then activates protein kinase A, which rushes off to phosphorylate its targets.
And just like with the G protein, there has to be an off switch.
There has to be. And that's the enzyme phosphodiesterase, which rapidly converts CAMP back to AMP. This balance is critical, and when it fails.
Well, that's where the cholera example is so powerful.
Right, what happens there?
The cholera toxin chemically modifies a G protein in your intestinal cells, locking it in the active state.
So it can't shut itself off.
It can't. So it constantly stimulates adenylyl cyclase, which leads to constant, crazy high CAMP production.
And that's what causes the cells to pump out massive amounts of salt and water,
resulting in the life-threatening diarrhea of cholera. It's a direct consequence of a broken off switch.
Wow. The other big second messenger is calcium ions, K2 plus DuO. What's interesting here is that its role is all about its scarcity.
Entirely. The concentration of calcium in the cytosol is kept incredibly low, like 10,000 times lower than outside the cell, mostly by ATP-driven pumps.
So any small increase is actually a huge signal.
A massive, non-ignorable signaling event, and that increase is often triggered by another small messenger called IP3, or inositol phosphate.
So how does IP3 work? Well, a signal can activate an enzyme, phospholyse C, which cleaves a membrane phospholipid into two parts, DAG and our star IP3.
Yep.
The IP3 is small and water-soluble, so it diffuses really quickly through the cytosol, and it acts like a key.
A key for what?
It binds to an IP3-gated calcium channel on the membrane of the endoplasmic reticulum, which is the cell's internal storage depot for calcium.
So IP3 is the key that unlocks the door to the calcium storage tank.
Precisely. The gate opens, stored calcium floods out into the cytosol, the concentration skyrockets, and that activates the next set of proteins to trigger the response.
Which brings us to the final output,
Yeah.
the response. And this can be slow, like a nuclear response where a gene gets turned on, or really fast, like a cytoplasmic response that just alters an enzyme's activity.
And the epinephrine cascade is the perfect illustration of that amplification we talked about. Remember our impala?
Right.
One single epinephrine molecule binds one receptor. That leads to the cascade with the G protein, CMP, and a couple of protein kinases. And finally, the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase is activated.
And the numbers are just staggering.
They are. That one initial binding event can activate about 100 G proteins, which leads to so many downstream activations that ultimately that one molecule of epinephrine results in the release of about 100 million glucose molecules.
100 million from one. That multiplicative effect is the entire reason for these pathways.
It is, but we also need specificity. Epinephrine makes liver cells release glucose, but it makes heart cells contract faster. Why the difference?
It must be the internal wiring.
Exactly. Different cells have different collections of receptor, relay, and response proteins. They're all hearing the same external signal, but they're built to interpret it and respond differently.
And to make all this efficient, especially in the thick, viscous cytosol, cells use scaffolding proteins.
Yes, these are large relay proteins that physically hold several other signaling proteins together at the same time.
So it's like a molecular workbench, keeping everything organized.
It dramatically increases the speed and accuracy of the signal transfer because the molecules don't have to just float around hoping to bump into the right partner. The importance of this is really clear when you look at something like Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome, or WAS.
What's that?
It's an inherited disorder caused by the absence of just one crucial scaffolding protein, and without it, signaling in key immune cells is completely disorganized. The missing link just disrupts the whole chain.
Okay, so if that's what happens when one protein is missing, let's talk about a response that requires the absolute ultimate coordination. Apoptosis, programmed cell death.
Apoptosis, which literally means falling off, isn't random cell death, it is absolutely vital.
It's essential for normal development, right? Like carving out the spaces between our fingers and toes in the embryo.
That and for eliminating damaged, infected, or potentially cancerous cells in the adult body, it's the body's quality control system.
And the mechanism is tightly controlled. The enzymes of destruction, the caspases and nucleuses, are already there but inactive in healthy cells.
Right, the death signal has to activate a cascade instantly, like pulling the pin on a grenade.
And a lot of what we know about this came from studying a simple worm, C. elegans.
It did. In the worm, the key break on the whole process is a protein called SEED9, which sits on the mitochondrial membrane. A death signal inactivates SED9, which releases its hold on another protein, SED4. Active SED4 then activates the master executioner, the caspase SED3, and that triggers cell suicide.
In mammals, it's more complicated.
Much more intricate. We have a mitochondrial pathway where death signals cause the mitochondria to leak proteins, and surprisingly, one of those is cytochrome C.
Wait, cytochrome C, the protein from the electron transport chain for making energy.
The very same. When it's released into the cytosol, it acts as a powerful cell death factor.
So the decision to live or die is an integration of all these signals.
A massive integration. Cells are constantly weighing external signals like death ligands from other cells against internal alarm signals like irreparable DNA damage from the nucleus or too many misfolded proteins in the ER.
And when this integration fails, the consequences are severe.
Absolutely. Failure of apoptosis is a hallmark of cancer. It lets damaged cells survive. And on the flip side, excessive inappropriate apoptosis is linked to neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.
Looking back at the whole journey, it really is a movement from a single contact and reception through this hugely amplified cascade in transduction to a really specific output in response.
That's it.
And what stands out to me right up to that final response of apoptosis is the need for speed and precision, this constant balancing act between on and off.
Precisely. The ability of a G protein to shut itself off, the power of phosphatases to reset kinases, that's what allows a cell to respond to stress in milliseconds and then immediately be ready for the next signal. Reversibility is the key feature that lets life adapt from moment to moment.
You know, that idea of reversibility really changes how you think about even basic sensations. Think about tasting a salty chip. You rinse your mouth, the salty taste is gone almost instantly. And that's because the salt receptor is just a ligand-gated ion channel. It's fast, passive, no amplification.
Right, the ions just flow in, then they're gone.
But if you eat a savory chip, something with that umami flavor from glutamate, and you rinse your mouth, that rich, savory taste kind of lingers, doesn't it?
It does. It sticks around for a minute or two.
And that's because the umami receptor is a GPCR. It kicks off a complex, multi-step signal transduction pathway with amplification and second messengers. So, could that persistent savory flavor, compared to the instant flash of salt, be explained entirely by the mechanics of its receptor, a simple channel versus a complex, long-running GPCR cascade?
That's a fascinating thought. It perfectly captures the molecular difference between instant detection and a lasting cellular conversation.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the molecular language of life.